And just to add a note that this year's edition of the of Sefer, the Jewish Book Festival, is also joining the European Days of Jewish Heritage, and their theme this year is dialogue, and so is ours. And so we're here in dialogue with Sally Berkovic coming in from London. So I'm just going to give a little bit of a bio of Sally before I let her talk, because this is her session. So Sally was born in Australia, and she's the daughter of Slovakian Holocaust survivors. She studied at Melbourne University and worked as a social worker and academic for several years. She lived in Jerusalem and New York before an epistolary romance brought her to London in 1993, where she established a freelance writing career while her children were young. Since 2009, she has been the CEO of the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe, supporting Jewish heritage and culture across Europe. She's also an author of 2.5 books, I think, at this point, which we're going to be discussing in this session today. So in 1997, the first edition of Under My Hat was published, which is a social commentary cum memoir. You can see an example of it that Sally's holding up. Social commentary cum memoir outlining the challenges of raising daughters while straddling the tensions between an Orthodox religious life and the competing forces of secularism. Then just a couple of years ago, a new edition was published in 2019. I don't know if you can see this because my virtual background sometimes eats it.
Me too.
There you go. Which is augmented with an extensive introduction outlining the impact of more than 20 years of change, which was predicted quite presciently in the version from 20 years ago. And finally, which we're going to discuss today. And finally, this year, she's published also a book called Death Duties, which I'm going to share with all of you today. It's an ebook, and I will share with you a PDF for you to take home. It's currently available in English, and I think soon to be available in...
It's available in French and hopefully a Hebrew translation soon.
Yes. Thank you. So with that said, I'm gonna hand this over to Sally. I guess my first question really is, why did you write the original book in 1997?
Thanks, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining. I wrote it because I didn't want to be known as somebody staying at home with a couple of young children. I wanted to be identified as somebody more than that, because that would be terrible. And I had moved to London after being from New York, and I found England very odd. I still do, actually. But I'd been in New York, I'd been in Israel, I grew up in Australia, and I'd had all these different Jewish experiences. And I could see there were so many things were happening, and yet at the same time, London was so small C conservative, very little happened in London. And I was starting to think about putting that together, comparing things, trying to find my own place in the community, actually, and trying to understand all the changes that I saw abroad, sorry, that I saw abroad, but I didn't see happening in London. So there was that sort of sociological, quasi-academic part of it. But actually, I also wanted to reflect on my own life, and I wanted to have something to share with my children. I had 2 daughters at the time, and I talk about it in the book, and when we talk about death duties, it can be, might raise it as well. My own parents had died before I had my children, and I was very aware that I didn't really know very much about them for a whole variety of reasons. So there was a part of me, part joking, you know, I wanted to say that I was doing something, but part quite serious about my legacy, you know, what was going to be my legacy. And I wanted to give my kids something that they could hold on to. That was sort of quite a motivating force. So that was written, 20 years ago. And then, as you mentioned, I did an update that came out just before Corona, actually, which was great because I was able to do some events in person. And we discussed it. I just give a brief overview of that, and then you and I can have a conversation. And I wanted to do the update for a couple of reasons. One reason was I had changed. So, you know, what does that mean 20 years later? Did I still agree? What were my reflections 20 years later? I had another daughter, and I promised her a book. And this was a shortcut. I didn't have to do a whole new book. I could just do something smaller. So this the update is dedicated to her. But I also saw two broad changes that were facilitating a lot in Orthodoxy. And one obvious one is technology, that technology, I would argue, has disrupted Orthodoxy. Women are sharing their lives, or they're telling each other about what they're doing. They're sharing halachic decisions. They are finding out about, oh, do you have a minion that does this? Does your community do that? So as simple as Facebook groups have changed, I wouldn't say they've changed Orthodoxy, but they've impacted on women's lives, and they are slowly eroding away at established expectations. And people have more information. And so I thought that was very interesting to see what's happening. And also technology-wise, it's enabled much more of this global Jewish community. Everybody talks about, peoplehood and global Jewish world and these phrases, but actually the technological revolution has enabled that. And we've only seen that accelerated through COVID. So even, things like dating apps, to hear what's happened in other communities, all of that has transformed what Jewish life looks like. But I think the biggest change has happened in the Orthodox community around technology. So I wanted to do that and discuss that. That sort of gave me the impetus. And I saw that there were 3 or 4 main broad areas, actually more areas of change. One was the life cycle, and we can come back and talk about it in more detail, but things like celebrating the birth of a baby girl, having bat mitzvahs that were much more meaningful in the Orthodox community, weddings where women under the chuppah were participating more, women saying Kaddish. Now, I don't know enough about your own communities, but in Orthodox communities in general, until maybe 10 years ago, women did not say Kaddish. There are some communities, and there are many communities where that continues to be the case, but in many Orthodox communities, women are saying Kaddish. In some communities, women didn't used to go to the cemetery. Now they are doing that. They will give a hesped, a eulogy. So these things were happening, and I felt they needed to be documented in one place. So the life cycle event, issues around the body, I thought had changed in the last 20 years. When I wrote the original version, there was no discussion around modesty. It just wasn't a topic. But what I'd noticed in the last sort of 10 years, this obsession with women's skirt lengths, with women's collarbones, all the sort of women's bodies being being blamed, what women had done with their bodies being blamed for tragedies in the Jewish community. And there was a lot of this modesty shaming. And I just thought, it was just fascinating. I was going to say it's terrible. I don't want to it'd be too easy just to sort of put a value judgment on it, but it was fascinating to see that. And those of you who keep up with the news in Israel, you would have seen, protests where women go publicly and erasing of women's photos. All of this sort of stuff is relatively new. And we can argue or discuss why we think it's the case. I think it's partly as a backlash for all the advancements that women have made. Another area is around education. Women are now learning Talmud, the Daf Yomi, the daily Talmud shiur that was closed to women for centuries. It's a relatively new phenomenon anyway, but Talmud study in general was closed to women, except for, there were always exceptions, but they proved the rule that it was not available in general to women. Has changed, has transformed. There's a women's Daf Yomi, many opportunities for women to learn the Talmud every day or to learn in a weekly class, whatever they want. That's also tied in with technology, that texts are more available. Sefaria, if you're not familiar with it, is a wonderful resource. But there are things, women are engaged with text. Women are more engaged with making decisions. There's a course to help those women who want to be called what's a yoetz at halacha, a halachic advisor in particular areas. It tends to be around family, rules of family purity and sexuality, but also women can now supervise kashrut, kosher food, and being a mashgiach, mashgicha. So that involvement in education is a tremendous change in the last 20 years. Leadership, women taking on more communal roles, both in lay roles. So even in London, you wouldn't have a president of an Orthodox shul till about, again, maybe about 10, 12 years ago, women could be presidents. Couldn't be presidents. That's changed. But more significantly, and those of you who follow this, Orthodox women rabbis. This is a new phenomena. it's fascinating, again, to watch what's happening. What is the role of a rabbi? Who gets to call somebody a rabbi? Who is the designating authority to give the smicha degree? All these issues are changing the face of orthodoxy. And that the last one I put down are the economic drivers, I think is a very interesting challenge, is women are earning their own money now. Not every woman, not everywhere, but women they don't have to stay in marriages if they don't want to, if they, they have more economic independence. They're also not getting married as much as they, at as young age as they are used to, which also has implications for childbirth and fertility. So the economic drivers are very interesting around the impact on Orthodox women. So it's those very broad areas that I address in the update in this update. So you have the original book, which is much more has issues and historical issues, and I talk about women that I admire and historical figures and some of the challenges and issues of Aguanota. But then and I weave it in with my own personal experiences and my own family, with that parental sort of talking to my children element. This updated version is much more, I guess, reportage. I haven't commented on my kids because they're in their 20s and they would certainly not give me permission. And I knew that if I asked, I would not get permission, and I didn't want to do it without their permission. But when they were, 3 years old, I didn't really care. I didn't say anything about them so much. But I'd have what to say about them now, but I wouldn't put it in print. So that's, so that's where, that's sort of an overview of the book. So perhaps if you wanted to explore further any of those topics.
Absolutely. And thank you. And I also like how you've sort of separated the original book and the update. And even now, when you were mentioning kind of there's a stylistic difference as well, that the update is much more kind of reportage is the word that you used. It's I would say almost kind of more academic, more.
Well, I'm not sure, because I know there are a couple of academics in the crowd and they might not think so, but it has a few footnotes though. Academic light.
Yes, well, I guess in comparison, it's more. I think it's an observation of what's going on and an update. And one thing that I think is important to note is that this second version of the book includes the first version within it.
Yes.
So the first, it has kind of this essay that's maybe 75 to 100 pages long, with all of these updates and all of these insights about what is going on in the Orthodox world today with relation to women. And then it transitions into what was exactly the original book in 1997, right, which I personally loved. I loved being able to have both in one book. So I want to start by asking you about the original book,
sure,
which has a very different tone. It's, as you said, it was more memoir. It's much more personal. Your children were young and you wanted to leave them something. You were talking about your parents. You were talking about them knowing you as a person and not just as a parent. And one thing that really came through to me a lot in reading that book is the level of grief that really kind of comes through the book itself, because you're reading the kind of the soul of this young mother who lost her parents before she had children, and kind of grappling with that. And so on the one hand, grappling with it on a human level that is true to anyone, whether they're Jewish or not, of kind of what do you do? How do you raise the next generation without being able to ask your own parents? And then there's this very specific Jewish element, the Orthodox Jewish element of not being allowed to say Kaddish. And so I wanted to ask you a little bit, if you could talk a little bit about that grief, if you are okay with talking about it.
I'm just thinking about going a step back. Sorry, it's not Corona. I've picked up a terrible cough. My parents were Holocaust survivors. You mentioned that in the introduction. And that was a shadow in our family, definitely. And it's only as I got older and became a parent myself, I realized that my own parents didn't have role models for parents, in that they were left as young. My father came to Australia when he was 16, 17, as young orphans. So they had to then become adults themselves without any parental guidance. So they parented us, my brother and I, beautifully. I genuinely have no complaints. But when I think about that, like, what sort of modeling did they have? What did they bring back from their own childhood memories in order to parent? And I've often thought about that in relationship to my own sense of loss, is that they never complained. They never said, oh, we didn't know what to do. They just sort of got on with things. And that was a sort of survivor mentality. That's how they survived. You sort of get on with it. And I did often thought to myself, if they heard me wallowing in self-pity about, oh, I wish they were around, I'm so, they'd say, oh, just get on with it. Stop complaining. Stop, feeling sorry for yourself. So grief is sometimes, I don't say minimized. Oh, yes. Depending who you're talking to and how in the context, like my father would always say, and I'm sure you've all heard this, this too will pass. This too will pass. Like whenever I would come home complain about anything from school, this too will pass. And that's sort of become my motto with my own kids. And in a way, you minimize people's experiences, and it's a bad thing to say to people, actually, because you're not acknowledging what they're experiencing. So I'm saying that as part of my answer because I think it sort of gives a bit of context. So when I had not only my parents were here, but I was also in England, and so I was away from my friends, my support group. I came here, and my husband's lovely, and fortunately we were able to have children fairly quickly. So I didn't have sort of a established group around me of a natural support network. So the two things combined, really, and I think it might have even been being in London that was more difficult in some ways. But I was jealous of other people, and that added to the grief. So that you have this stark reminder that at life cycle events, I would think, oh, at the bat mitzvah, my kids won't have their grandparents around, or my children didn't have grandparents. So I was grieving for myself, but actually it was at another level. I was grieving for my children in advance of what they don't even realize they're not going to have, if that makes sense. And now my kids are in their 20s. I don't know what their, long-term plans are, but their grandparents are not going to be at any weddings. What they're going to, I'm going to use the word stain, which I've never used before in this context. It sounds rather terrible, but it's a blot. There is something missing there, which is universal. That's not a Jewish feeling. It's only exacerbated at Jewish life cycle moments, but everybody has life cycle moments. And I do see, and I have to contain my jealousy when I see people with 4 generations together. I have to really say, be grateful for what you've got, stop it, and that's a personal challenge I have. The Kaddish, sorry. So when my mother died, which was first, it was so awful. And I wrote in the book, I just sort of did what I was told. I didn't really think, to be honest. And I was observant, but I just it was so sort of out of my control. It was all a big, everyone was involved except for me. I had no idea what was going on. So I didn't argue with anybody, and I just, as I said, did what I was told. And also my father was low. I didn't want to upset him, and I just didn't really think it through. Later on, I thought it through, and I thought, why was I like that? How pathetic was I? And anyway, you put that to one side. And then years later, when my father died, I was much more in control, and I knew what I wanted. But also, it was just at the cusp of that time when women were saying Kaddish. Not quite, actually. It's 22 years ago. So it wasn't quite. So, but there was a bit of a movement. And I was in America when he died, and I had to go to Australia and come back to America, whatever. And in America, women were starting to say Kaddish. So it was a little different. There was more, there was a bit more of in a way, there was a bit of an expectation that women in certain circles would say Kaddish. And if I could just pick up on that particular thing, now what I'm finding, and I've thought about writing about it, it's almost Kaddish shaming. Now women are able to say Kaddish. It's not a problem. Certainly in my shul, and there's a lot of the modern Orthodox shuls, in the United Synagogue in London, which is the mainstream Orthodox community, the chief rabbi has said women are welcome to say it. They put out a booklet on how to do it, everything else. many women feel uncomfortable. They're just not used to it. Nothing halachic, got nothing to do with Jewish law. They just have a visceral reaction. It's not what they do. And what's interesting about that is that other women sort of, as I say, Kaddish shame them. Why don't you want to say it? You can do it. Why, I'll help you. People sort of, they don't want to. They want to sit at the back of the shul and maybe reflect, think. They don't want to do it. And that's an interesting dynamic, that it's felt, some women feel that other women are letting the team down. Here you have this opportunity and you're throwing it away. I've babbled on a little bit about that because I have quite a few thoughts on that one.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And thinking about my own experience, I told you my father passed away a couple of years ago, right before I was getting married, and I didn't know how to say Kaddish because I wasn't trained, I wasn't educated to read Hebrew, and I remember being with my aunt who was showing me kind of transliterations and helping me say it, and then we got to the burial. And the rabbi was leading us in a slightly different version of Kaddish. And so my aunt was suddenly kind of throwing her arms up in the air and saying, "This is not how it's done. This is wrong. This cannot be." My mother wished that nobody was making her do anything because she didn't want to do, and I was sort of trying to mumble along and not really knowing at all. And I think at any burial, what you described just now about, being upset with yourself about how you responded when your mother passed away. I just, from one person to another, I want to tell you, there is no wrong way
Sure.
To handle that kind of grief. But I think that yes, what you're describing in terms of women having these opportunities now within the Orthodox community of being able to recite Kaddish, of it no longer being limited to only men are able to do it, is exemplary of one of some of the changes that you were describing especially in the updated version of your book. So in the overview, you were talking a little bit about education of women's increased educational opportunities, but particularly about their leadership and kind of their place in the community in more leadership roles. And so I wanted to ask you about that in the context of, like I said, I couldn't say the Kaddish because I never learned how to read and how to say it. So I wanted to ask you a bit about what you're seeing in the Orthodox community in terms of women reading the texts, reading and studying the texts, and how has that changed in the last 20 years, but also how do you see that developing in the near and medium future?
Sure. So it's been tremendous changes, and I think in a way more than the ritual changes are these educational changes, because once you can't unknow what you know, and once women learn things, they can take part in the discourse, they can have a view, they can make their own halachic opinions, and they can choose what they want to do. So what we're seeing on a very practical level, well, I was just about to talk about, there are still, I'll just talk about the UK, and I don't know the school system in Spain, and I don't know where else people are listening in from. In the UK, there are maybe a very extensive network of Jewish schools. In most of those schools, the boys will learn Talmud and the girls will not learn Talmud. So just for clarification, there's the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, and then the Tanakh, the whole Tanakh, and then there's something else called the Talmud or the Gemara, which is partly the Mishnah, and then the commentaries on the Mishnah. So we're talking about different things. Girls learn Bible, they do their Parshat HaShavua, the weekly Parsha that's read in the synagogue. They will learn about the prophets. They'll learn things like Megillat Esther, the scroll of Esther, the scroll of Ruth. Those things, that's not a problem for women to learn. The Talmud, the body of law, and the Mishnah, all the commentaries, that has been considered problematic for women. And that's a whole other discussion. And that has continued, unfortunately, in the school. It sort of starts in the school system where girls are excluded from that. There is one school here where the girls are taught Talmud, but the truth is that the boys and the girls are taught badly. It's very hard to teach it well. It's very hard to get good Jewish studies teachers. That's a whole sort of global problem. There are a few schools in the States where girls are having exactly the same curricula as the boys and learning Talmud. Then if we jump to the seminary year in Israel, which I think has actually been a pivotal year, the gap year between school and university, many kids go on a kibbutz program, they go with Hashameh, with Habonim, B'nai Akiva, all the different youth groups, or they go to a yeshiva or a seminary. And it's at this seminaries where the big changes have happened. And I can speak from experience. I've got 3 girls. They all went to seminary. They went to different, 2 went to one particular one and 1 went to a different one. The seminaries they chose teach the girls Talmud. There are seminaries where the girls are not taught Talmud, that's fine. They went there and it was their first exposure to Talmud, and they were shocked by how much some of the American kids knew, but they were also shocked by how much they didn't know. They didn't realize even what they hadn't been taught. I mean, I'd been telling them they were having a rubbish Jewish education, but they didn't believe me. Anyway, so they had a year in Israel, which was actually transformative for each of them in different ways. But there they learned from other women and male rabbis, but they learned from other women. They learned the texts. They learned how to learn. They learned to read. It's not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic. It's tough. It's hard to read all this stuff. I mean, there are Hebrew translations. There are English translations. It's all accessible now. So there's no excuse for anybody not to learn Talmud if you're in English. Well, I think there might even be some Spanish versions. I don't know. But it's certainly, again, Safari has a German translation now of Talmud. So these things are accessible. So at least women are getting the familiarity with the language. Who are the rabbis of the Talmud? What were the topics discussed? What were some of the decisions? Who are the main characters? What was going on? Now you have this daf yomi that I mentioned before. You're learning a daily daf, a daily page of the Talmud. This started maybe about 100 years ago in Poland. And it was always men, because women didn't learn anything. I mean, you've got to put the women's learning in the context of broader women's learning and the suffragette movement and feminism. You need to contextualize what's happened to Orthodox women as well. But we now have outstanding women who are Talmudic scholars. And I think that it's a small number. I'm not pretending, but given that in 20 years we have produced a number of scholars who are women who are writing not just about women's issues. I think the big mistake is for women to write just about women's issues. Can you breastfeed in the synagogue? That's an important topic, but a man can write about that or a woman can write about it. I think it's important that the topics are not marginalized to be about women's issues. That's a bit of a tangent there, but women are commenting on these things, and that they become leaders, because once you choose to ask a woman a question, you are making her a leader. You're making her a decisive, and you vote with your feet, with your mouth. You vote. You send in a question and you get replies. There's a couple of websites called Sheila Tshuva. I think it's actually called Sheila Tshuva, question and answer, and it's answered by women, by Matan. There's a number of. If people are interested in the resources, I can send them to you, even you can pass them on. There are some SEMs in Israel that are particularly impressive. There's a couple in America as well that are doing that, and that will change. It's slowly, but we've been around for thousands of years. It's amazing what's happened in 20 years, actually. Women are not putting up with being excluded anymore. There are, and I'm talking, I guess, generally I hate the word modern Orthodox, but in that sort of modern liberal camp, there are women to the right in the more Hasidic, Haredi communities. Those sort of things are not happening, but there is change in the Haredi community. There definitely are changes, perhaps not as quickly as in the modern Orthodox, but there are definitely changes.
Well, thank you. I do want to talk a little bit about the book that you published this year. Right. And I'm going to share my screen for a moment so that people can see it. See if we can get this to work. Okay, hopefully you're seeing now the cover of this book. And now I've lost you guys. There you are. Yes, so Sally's new book, this is out this year in 2021, is called Death Duties. And I want to let you describe a little bit, but this goes to what we were talking about before in terms of life cycle events and their importance in obviously, I think it's silly to say their importance in Judaism, because I think they're important in any in any human tradition, but specifically the changes in the last 20 years of including women in life cycle events, or creating new ceremonies in order to celebrate women's life cycle events that perhaps wasn't done until very recently.
Right.
This one is specifically about the duties the duties after death. So I'd like to let you talk to us a little bit about this book.
Sure. Thank you for calling it a book. It's more, I call it more of a booklet. But it's
a booklet.
I've been working on the work. I've been volunteering at the Chevra Kadisha, the Burial Society, for about 10, 12 years. And I started to do that partly, well, I wanted to give myself sort of a birthday present, a significant birthday present. And I appreciate that sounds rather morbid, but I wanted to sort of do something significant. And so I joined the Burial Society, and I started, as you get older, I thought, well, who buried my parents? What happened? What does happen to the body? You can read a little bit about what happens, but there was something very, very physical, very primitive almost, that I wanted to understand what this was about. So I joined the Chevra Kadisha, and I write in the booklet. It starts off basically with the process of what happens to the body. And I actually put myself in that position, like what will happen to me. So the first half a dozen pages are very much descriptive of what happens to the body in terms of being cleaned, in terms of being wrapped in the tachrichim, the special clothes that you wear. People don't know these words. They don't know these terms. You end up in a set of clothing, which I didn't write in the book because it sounded a bit blasphemous. You basically look like somebody from the Ku Klux Klan. You're dressed in white with a sort of a caped hood on and a mask over your face, and you look, yes, well, you're mummified. I mean, not body wise, but sort of the way you end up looking. But it is done. So I've done it sort of Sunday mornings, my rota day. So I've done it for quite a while now, and it's extraordinary because the room is, not a word is said other than, pass the scissors, pass this, pass that. It's an amazing serenity there, and you're dealing with all sorts of, well, you don't know anything about the people. It's all very anonymous, and that's why, doing a tahara or anything to do with death is called a chesed shel emet, a deed that has really no reward. It's truthful for itself. Now, the issue was when I joined the Chevra, I was told you mustn't tell anybody you're on the Chevra. It's private, blah, blah, blah. We have to be modest about it. And I thought that was great. I thought that was really appropriate. Nobody needs to know I'm doing it. My husband barely knew where I was going. I had no problem with that at all. But I was at a Shabbat lunch once with an American woman who I didn't know. She was a guest of my friend. And she started saying, oh, what our Chevra, we do this. I don't know why. I don't even know why she started talking about the Chevra Kadisha, but she started almost showing off about it. And I was so struck. And I said to her, oh, that's really interesting. But in London, from what I didn't even tell her I did it. I said, well, from what I understand in London, you don't talk about it. It's something that's private. I'm really interested that you're mentioning this. And she goes, oh, don't be, the way, don't want to be stereotypical, but, she was just so confident. She said, don't be ridiculous. Death is part of life. How are you going to recruit new people to come onto the Chevra if you don't tell them about it? People need to understand. And I thought, she's right. I just thought, gosh, she's, So this was quite a few years ago, and I just sort of planted in my mind. But I mentioned it to a couple of the people in the UK who were really like, no, we don't talk about it. So, I stayed quiet. And then I did a talk that went down well, and I just decided I'm going to do what I want to do. And then I wrote this booklet, which has had very positive feedback. In fact, in Geneva, somebody saw it and they translated it into French. They printed it and then distributed it to the community just now before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur as part of the pre-Yontiv pack of materials, partly as a recruitment drive, because the guy in Geneva was telling me they've got everyone's over the age of 70, 75 doing the chevra. They need to recruit young people, but because nobody talks about it, nobody knows about it. And this has worked. He said he's had a dozen or so people inquiring as to what would be involved in joining and how much time commitment, et cetera, et cetera. So it was, yes, I feel like it's a public service, really. So I wrote about what happens, but I also then reflect on the Kaddish and my own experiences of, unfortunately, since my parents died, then my brother died, my younger brother died, and then turns out there was serious heart stuff, and then I had heart surgery because I was about to kick the bucket, and which was very lucky that I got caught in time. So I talk about that. I mean, it's not a morose book. I know it sounds like that, but it's but I wanted to, at the end of the day, it's life. That you've got to. And I show hopefully a lot of appreciation and gratitude through that process. And then the book ends with, I talk about the changes in Kaddish there, but it also ends with what's happened during Corona and the grief people experienced during Corona of not being able to go to funerals, but also what happened to the chevra. So if people over 70 were not allowed to go and do the chevra duties. Also, anybody with a compromised health, and because of my heart issues, I couldn't do it. So I really have missed doing the chevra. So in a way, writing, and I wrote this during lockdown, and in a way, this was my chevra duty because I somehow needed to do something. And so I talk about that at the end, that the women who did do the chevra, they couldn't do the proper washing, that there were a lot of compromises in what to do with the body. So generally what was done, the bodies were placed in the coffins, they weren't tampered with, and the tachrichim, the clothes, which they normally would have been dressed in, were just placed on top of them in the coffin, and then they were buried. Nobody went to funerals. I'm sure it was all the same in Spain as well. And then people didn't have the shiva, they would have a shiva on Zoom. So quite a bit's been written about that, but I talk about that towards the end of the book. And, what is the impact of that on a family's ability to grieve? And I think it's, and I kept thinking, my goodness, if I had to have flown to Australia, I have friends who Australia itself was landlocked and you couldn't get in. I have friends in Israel who couldn't go and visit their sick parents. It's been awful for them. I'm sure some of you have been in that situation as well. So I guess I wanted, and then at the end of the book, there's a series of questions thinking about how to have difficult conversations about planning for your death. Cremation is an issue. An increasing number of Jews want to be cremated. That's their choice. Increasing numbers of increasing numbers of people who are changing gender. Who do they get? Who do the male, because men do the men and women do the women. So if there's somebody who's transitioning, where does that person get, who does the tahara for them? So I touch on these issues. I don't go into them in length. I'm not qualified to comment. They're so complex, but I just note them because I don't want to pretend, I don't want anybody to think I haven't thought about them, but I'm not qualified to comment on them. Does that give you enough of a sense of it?
I think so. There's one thing that you said when talking about this book, that you promise it's not morose, and it made me realize that I need to say that your style of writing, it's, even though I've been asking you about grief and we've been talking about death and all these things, but your style of writing is so witty. It's so without being kind of disrespectful. It's not right. Kind of this. It's not cynical in any way. But it does have this, it's a pleasure to read. It doesn't bring you down and kind of the weight of the world. No, it's talking about very heavy issues in a very interesting and engaging way. So thank you for that. I'm going to pause here to open the floor to questions from the audience. I'll repeat, if you prefer to type it into the chat, you can do so and I'll read it aloud. Or if you'd like to ask your question directly, feel free to raise your hand either via Zoom or like this, and hopefully I'll see it. Maybe not from the 6 people from the Jewish retreat, because I don't know if I can, it's a little bit dark, but if somebody...
Where are you on retreat? Are you in Barcelona on retreat or somewhere more exotic?
I think they're saying yes. I think they're here in Barcelona.
Right.
But they're coming from elsewhere. So I think you're exotic for them. And meanwhile, I'm going to share in the chat a couple of links to Sally's website, to where you can purchase the Under My Hat book. If you're in the UK, there's a I think it's a discount from the publisher if you're in the UK. And there's also an Amazon link if you're in the US. I see someone who's from Australia. I didn't look up Amazon Australia.
Who's that?
And I don't know if you want to...
Do I know you? Do I know you from Australia?
I don't know if I've just uncovered you, Annette, but she may not be able to unmute right now. But yeah, so I'm going to share these links in the chat, and I see Albert has a question. So Albert, if you'd like to go ahead, and and I'm also going to share the PDF of death duties in the chat. So save it to your computer so it doesn't disappear when we close the session. Albert, go ahead.
First of all, thank you, Sally, for sharing all of this. I have several friends in Europe who are involved in this very inspiring, I don't know how to call it, wave movement reality of Jewish traditional Orthodox female-led changes. I was just wondering, I've been following a lot of the things that you've been mentioning. How important and how relevant is it for what's happening, or how real it is, that the component of intergenerational like fight or sisterhood or cooperation? Like, how do you feel different generations are working with this together, if that's something that's happening? Or how do you feel older generations are responding to what newer generations are bringing to the table?
Certainly in the UK, what's interesting and partly inspiring, but also very sweet to see, is I go to what's called a partnership minyan. So it's Orthodox. I mean, some people will say it's not Orthodox, whatever. Rabbi Sperber, Orthodox rabbi, is sort of the head of that, or halakhic guidance, where men and women, I don't know how familiar people are with it, men and women sit separately. Men do certain parts that only men can do in a traditional Orthodox service, and then the women share in the laning, the reading of the Sefer Torah, and they do a few other bits as well. And what's interesting is when older women come, so they're coming for the bat mitzvah or a granddaughter, or they're just coming, and they're called up, they get an aliyah to the Torah, they're called up to the Torah, and they say the blessings, and they've never seen inside a Sefer Torah before, because they've always gone to an Orthodox shul, and now we're offering them the opportunity to see inside a Sefer Torah. Many of them just cry. They're just like so overwhelmed. But I've been with women in their 80s and 90s, and they sort of feel like, my birthright was taken from me. This is outrageous. And some of them are the staunchest, then become the staunchest supporters. They don't necessarily want to learn how to do anything, but they're very supportive. So they're that sort of, and they keep us going in a way. And and then you have the younger generation. I mean, I think me and my kids, see, my kids sort of think I'm just odd, you know, because they take everything for granted. They are, what's the big deal, mum? You don't get it. It's not a big deal. It's I'm so passé. You know, they just think it's so passé now. They don't understand. It's a bit like, you know, young women don't understand the feminist struggle. So I think the women in their probably 20s, 30s, they don't really understand how it was to get to this point. But I now see young girls, 14, 15, they've had their bat mitzvah. They're now, you know, regularly laning a little bit, and they see themselves firmly, well, we'll get to this, they still see themselves aligned with the Orthodox community and more involved. My concern will be whether they'll stay within the Orthodox community. I'm not convinced they will, to be honest. And the group that I'm talking about, we're a small group, in some ways quite marginal, in many ways completely misunderstood. We're not a coherent group, which is good because we come at it from very different angles, and we're quite an eclectic bunch. But I also think change comes from within those circles, comes from the outside. but I also don't think we're ever going to become the majority. I'm not naive in that regard. We don't have the numbers. I think the education piece, we've potentially got the numbers, not around ritual. And I think as more and more young people get, my kids take it for granted that they can have access to things now. Now that they understand the system, which is great. Does that sort of answer your question? Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Also, Annette says here that she is from Australia, but is currently in Barcelona. So.
Oh, right. Where in it's all right. Okay. Just look at the chat if there's anything.
And I see Victor has a question. Go ahead, Victor.
Yes, thank you, Eva, and especially thank you, Sally, for your presentation. I wanted to ask you because, well, you are talking a lot about the UK, but you know very well Europe, and you are very exposed to what's happening all around. And I wanted to ask you two questions, maybe one more broad, in terms of how do you foresee in the future in this field? And the second one, when we are talking about certain changes in any community, changes goes always with some reluctances or some reserves, and I wanted to ask you how the communities are managing these changes. Do you think that there's in some ways it's a normal evolution, because also the surround society it's moving towards that direction? It's something that has many obstacles and it's going to take maybe generations, or we are talking about changes that are happening in the near future?
Thanks, Victor. To answer your first question, I do see quite a bit of Europe through my job. And the biggest, and we've had this conversation before, the number of people outside of, say, England, France, and bits of Germany who are Jewishly literate and know the there's a huge problem with Jewish literacy. Forget ritual changes and innovation and all of that. Just know, yes, you'll have your religious community. I'm talking about where you've got religious communities, whether you've got Chabad or some other group, they know their stuff, they're doing what they do, they're not looking to change, and that's fine. And they provide a service for other people who might be interested in religious practices. But where you've got, let's talk about the Moshe houses and that sort of innovation across Europe, and you've got these Moshe houses, or you've got your community centers, the level of Jewish knowledge in many of these places is very poor. So you can't actually have, we're trying to improve it, but you can't actually have a conversation about this sort of stuff unless you know enough Jewish stuff. It's this sort of change and challenge to orthodoxy is predicated on having a good basic knowledge. Without that, there's no discussion to be had. So while I have seen, there are pockets of Base Berlin is a fabulous example in Berlin. They're wonderful. Both Americans who come with a huge amount of knowledge themselves have attracted Americans in Berlin and some locals as well. And they're doing, so that's a great example of change that's happening. But again, I would assume, and I haven't discussed it with them, they're fairly, I want to say marginal. They do their thing. They have a particular audience. They're not looking to revolutionize all of German Jewry, nor should they, and that's not part of their brief. It's always going to be a bit marginal, this stuff. So I don't think there's enough places in Europe that can sustain, in terms of orthodoxy, that can sustain this sort of change, because you can't, unless you've got your, as I said, Chabad or other Haredi community, you go to Vienna or you go to Zurich where there's the Haredi communities, all that's irrelevant. All of this is irrelevant to them. There may be individuals in those communities that are interested in this, but they're not going to bring about change. You asked about reluctancies from communities. it sort of ties in, because it's, even what I'm involved in the UK, it's been pretty marginalized. You know, people, it's you can either try, the question is whether people want to become part of the mainstream and want to be part of the system, or want to stay outside of the system. So my involvement with Partnership Minyanim, I also belong to the United Synagogue, which is the mainstream Orthodox, and they don't approve of the Partnership Minyanim. Okay, I don't care. I mean, I can still do what I want as an individual. I still pay my dues to, you know, silly me, I'm paying both, but that's another conversation. So because it's small numbers and it's generally marginalized, it's seen as a threat, that's for sure. And there's a woman here who trained as an Orthodox woman, Rabbi Lindsay Taylor Goodharts. If any of you have followed this, I mean, you'd have to sort of be pretty much in the know to know about it. It's a huge threat, but it passed, you know, there was a big kerfuffle, everybody made a big noise. It's gone away, because at the end of the day, that we don't have the numbers. In a way, that's what I quite like. I quite like being on the margins of small things. But will we affect long-term change? I'm not sure. But I also believe in the black swan. You know, you never know what's going to be. I mean, I suppose Corona was the black swan. You don't know. I mean, I think women rabbis are the black swan, actually. Women Orthodox rabbis, in some ways, are that black swan. Yeah.
I just wanted to comment, it's interesting that you mention Base Berlin, because actually there are partners here in Mozaika.
Oh, right, great. Right.
So I actually wanted to ask Ahmed to say a couple of words about what we do with Base Berlin and the Kollel here at Casadret in Mozaika.
I just wanted to say that I mean, I would definitely agree with you, Sally, because I'm friends with both rabbis, and we've been able to get a small group that meets every Monday and participates online with them at the Kollel, which is now growing to be a sort of European-wide project.
Right.
And we're very excited that some of this Torah and is also present here in Barcelona and accessible to our community. You mentioned Rabbi Lindsay Goodhart, who also had a session with them, and we could also we also followed. So yeah, you know, I would also say that it is very exciting how also smaller communities are also being impacted by this, and a smaller community like the Barcelona one can also contribute to some of this and be a part of it and benefit and be active in some of this changes and discourses.
Right. So you've got good partners there.
And then I guess my last question. So initially it was going to be maybe a bit of sound like a bit of a combative question, because I think it was something you were struggling with in the original book that you wrote, where you were in 1990s, and you were very strongly criticizing what women's place is within Orthodoxy, and what the limitations are. But so I was going to ask you, sort of within all of these, knowing all of these limitations as well as you do, why did you choose to stay? But in the conversation that we've had today, we haven't really been talking about limitations. I mean, what I see is hope. What I see is real change. What I see is excitement about all of the different ways that women are being engaged, and women are not being, that sounds passive, but women are engaging with and kind of leading some changes within the community. So I'm trying to rephrase my question so it's not kind of why do you choose to stay within Orthodoxy, but rather kind of what are, and I think this is maybe what Victor already asked you, but what are you seeing as the big changes on the horizon that are, sorry, I'm looking for the word, that are kind of driving this change in the community? Sure,
and perhaps because I did think it, I knew you were going to ask me that, and I have thought about this question a lot, and I get asked a lot. And when I wrote the first edition, people said to me, "Oh, you're so angry." I thought, I'm not angry. Like I didn't recognize the person they were describing to me. It was quite interesting, and I didn't feel angry. I was just sort of stating what I thought. And about the no limitations, I sort of feel like I want to make sure nobody thinks I'm a Pollyanna. It's not perfect by any means. So when you say, why do you stay? I stay because it's interesting. I stay because I think, well, several reasons. I like ambiguity and I can handle that. I also, what I am deeply committed to and really believe is that unless there's an observant lifestyle, Judaism won't survive. The practice, now you can practice it in different ways within certain guidelines, I suppose, but I think without sort of Jewish behaviors and having those defined, then it's very, what are you maintaining? And orthodoxy for me provides that framework. It doesn't provide it for everybody, but it provides it for me. And I think there have to be many more entry paths into it. And I think the word orthodoxy is I'd rather talk about observance, and that way you have a better framework. But the issue of agunot, women who are not given a divorce from their husbands, I'm not, as I said, I don't want to be a Pollyanna. I'm not saying it's all resolved. The women having 14, 15 children and not using birth control, even though they might want to, and sort of mental health issues in some sections of the community. All these are problematic areas. That doesn't mean it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What's interesting to me is the people who leave orthodoxy, who say they don't believe anymore. I really admire that, because I think there are so many people in orthodoxy who just who don't believe anyway. But there's a phrase called orthoprax, and I think that's an interesting space to be in, where there's a commitment to the practice, maybe agnosticism. They're not quite sure what they think, but to actually take that leap of faith out is quite a brave thing to do, and a very difficult thing. So I wanted to make, because I didn't want you to think I was a Pollyanna, because that's for sure not, even though you're right, there are many interesting things happening, and there are many less limitations than there were 20 years ago. And so I think the future is education, the future of these women leaders. I think that's where the future lies. And then from those leaders, we just don't know yet how it's going to pan out. I think we're also going to see more single Orthodox women having babies. I already know several women that have done that. So we're going to see that sort of demographic. How's the community going to respond to those women? Are they going to get the same Shabbat lunch invitations that normative families get? You've got more gay women, Orthodox women and men. So you've got the social trends that are happening in other parts of the Jewish community are happening in the Orthodox community as well. And you need the leaders who are wise enough and sensitive enough to handle that. I'm not convinced we've got them, but hopefully we will in due course.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And I wish that we had another hour to continue talking about these things, because there are a lot of things that I wanted to ask you about, but I'm realizing that we're out of time.
Sure.
So I hope that we can do another session like this soon. And thank you for joining us here in Sefer. I want to remind the audience, thank you, Varda, for reminding me that you can also, if you're here in Barcelona, you can buy copies of Under My Hat at Casadret this whole week while we're doing Sefer until Sunday.
Nice. Oh, that's very nice. I didn't realize you had actual copies there.
Yes. And I also want to invite you
English. Fantastic.
Yes, it's in English. Yes.
Oh, good.
It's in British English, but no, I'm kidding. Yes, I'd also like to invite anyone who understands Spanish. I think the next session is in Spanish. To join us for another Zoom session at 8:30, which is discussing a new translation of the Sefer HaTemunah, the Book of the Figure from the Kabbalah. So that'll be at 8:30 here on Zoom. It's part of Sefer as well. And yeah, I want to thank you again, Sally, for joining us and for sharing all of this with us.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Thank you so much, Sally. And refuah shlema, take care of that cold. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thanks. Well, have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Good evening. Bye.
Did you want me to stay on for a second or no?
No, I think we're okay.
Okay, great. All right, lovely. Thanks so much.
Thanks
Bye.
Thank you so much, Sally.
Pleasure. Bye. Bye.
Ciao. Thank you for all the technical stuff.
No worries. The next session is 8:30. I'll set it up, and it is in Catalan, actually.
It's in Catalan. Okay, I wasn't sure because
Nice.
the book, every description I found about the book is in Spanish, and the title of the book is in